I want to thank you all here tonight for being here, and I know it's a commitment of your time on a Monday night. I also appreciate you coming out. I know we've got some politicians here. I know we've also got some teachers here. Would you all just give those folks a hand for coming out? This is one of those issues, Common Core, that not everyone's going to agree about, right? No matter what you do. And so my view is that I'm going to tell you sincerely what I believe and why I know it. Every single slide you're going to see here today, at the end of the talk, I'll put a website up. You can go to that website, you can get all this information yourself. Don't charge for it. You're not going to get data mined. No one's going to hit you up for money. You go to that, you get all that information. It is my earnest plea to you. If you don't know, most of you don't know me from Adam. There's no reason you should believe me. Take the information I give you and verify it yourself. Please, please. One of the reasons we find ourselves in the situation we find ourselves in is because it's just too easy to take the word of people, either because they've got the right letter before their name, or because we know them, or because they're in charge of things we think that only responsible people can be in charge of. You don't know me. Please take this information at the end. And if there's anything that you don't get or that's not on the website currently, because I've been traveling so much, I haven't had time to completely update the website, but we'll give it to you too. All right? So take that information, look into it yourself. I can tell you, this is the 95th talk I've given in Wisconsin, and about 170 talks in 30 different states. I've testified before 14 different state legislatures, talked to over 30 bishops and over 100 priests in all those places about Common Core in the Catholic schools. So that's my bio on all of this. As the lady pointed out, I do have some experience, nothing on a national level, writing curriculum and writing curriculum standards, primarily for the state of Texas. So I know a little bit about this. I'll tell you what I know, and then I want you to take this information and look yourself. So far, knock on wood, so far, in 95 Wisconsin talks, nobody who's actually sat through one of my talks has called me up to say you were lying about that. Not one. There are a bunch of people who haven't seen my talk, like the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, right, for instance, right, who make staggeringly odd claims about things that I've said, but they've never seen the talk. So I beg you, if you find something you think is not right or not true, let me know. And if I've made an honest mistake, I will absolutely let people know, but it hasn't had to happen yet. A couple other provisos, by the way, before I begin my talk. I want to make it absolutely clear that this talk is in no way, shape, or form intended to be anti-teacher, anti-principal, anti-school board. I have a tremendous amount of sympathy for our public schools in Wisconsin. And while it's true that many in the public schools support it, there are a lot who don't. We've heard from many of them in all the states I've been to. Many people involved with schools, many teachers testified against the Common Core, many supported it. I get what a complicated issue this is. Where I'm sympathetic is, none of your teachers asked for it. The ones who supported it are the ones who didn't. None of your principals asked for this. This came from the top. It was handed down. And so I am very sympathetic to our schools because they can't get, most of our schools really can't get out of this if they want to. We have the first school district in Wisconsin, Germantown, pulled out, right? And they're getting all sorts of help for pulling out, right? So things can happen. But again, I think as adults we can respectfully disagree about things. I don't expect to convince everybody of what my position is. But what I'm going to do, you will find out by the end of my talk that 95% of what I'm going to tell you comes from other experts. I'm passing on the information and citing it. So I want you to go ahead and get that information and look into it. You're going to hear from Department of Education lawyers tonight. You're going to hear from teachers unions tonight. You're going to hear from clinical psychiatrists tonight about Common Core. And don't shoot the messenger. Okay? I'll give you all the information I have. I'm going to tell you where to get it. And then judge based on what these experts have to say. Okay? The last thing I want to say is also, this is a hugely bipartisan problem. I don't think can you hear me okay? Yeah, I don't think I need a mic. If you're okay, I got a big mouth. I'll be fine. So, the other thing I want to say is that Common Core, I think it's a problem. I think it's a hugely bipartisan one. In the various states I've visited, it's neither a Democrat nor a Republican issue. In Republican states, including, I would argue, Wisconsin, the reason that no legislation was voted on about Common Core this year is because a couple of Republicans prohibited it. After the 4 Wisconsin state hearings, there was a lot of movement to craft legislation to alter or amend or even get rid of Common Core in Wisconsin. And whatever you think of that legislation, the reality is not one bit of it was ever allowed to be voted on. That's a problem. And so in this state, I see, to tell you the truth, Common Core is more of a Republican issue. It was Republicans who blocked any vote on any of it. In the state, I just got back from this weekend yesterday. I was in New Jersey talking in 3 different places. Even though Chris Christie is the governor, you've got a very blue state in New Jersey. It's more of a Democrat problem there. I guess whoever's got the power, and I think we're going to see pretty quickly, that not at the school board level, not at the school level, not at the teacher level, but certainly at the government levels, the highest levels of Common Core, this is a big money issue. Right? There's a lot of money coming in the states. There's a lot of money, both privately from people like the Bill Gates Foundation and Pearson Publishing, flowing into states, and there's a lot of money in all sorts of various forms coming from Washington into the states that take Common Core. Just out of curiosity, you may remember, right? How many of you saw a couple weeks ago, Indiana became the first state to formally back up? You keep hearing that Common Core is such a voluntary program, states weren't coerced, people can come and go if they want. Well, do you remember what happened 3 days after Indiana backed up? The federal government came in and said that Indiana is going to have to demonstrate to the federal government, to the Department of Education, satisfaction, that Indiana's remaining standards are as good as Common Core. Is that a bar you're ever going to meet if you're Indiana, by the way? The federal government came in and said, you will demonstrate to us, to our satisfaction, that Common Core that your standards are as high as Common Core. And if you do not, we will strip your waiver from No Child Left Behind away, and we will withhold $200 million of federal education money from you. That does not strike me as a program that the federal government is not interested in. That does not strike me as a program where you can voluntarily enter and exit. That strikes me as a lot of government control. And so it's a big deal how we got it. So then quickly then, there are 3 parts of this talk. 1, how did we get here? Number 2, what about the standards as we currently have them? What about English and math? And 3, whenever you get something this big and this comprehensive, it has a lot of tentacles that have nothing to do with education. We've already talked about money coming into the state. We've already talked about money going out of the state. All the different things that come with a program this big and this national. There are all sorts of arms. Almost all of those arms are in some way connected to Common Core, while they may not be Common Core specifically themselves. Okay? Last question, I promise. Here we are, nationwide. We're over 2 years into Common Core. In your state, you've been about a serious year in Common Core, but the roots go deeper than that. Can I ask you, as you sit here today, how many of you would say that your understanding of Common Core is vague or fuzzy, or you're just not sure what it is? Would you raise your hand? And would everybody please look around? It's like 95% of you. 95% of you. Do you understand why these talks are necessary? Even if we quibble over some of the details? 95% of you in this room have kids or grandkids in these schools. And they're going through Common Core. And no one's ever really seriously bothered to explain to you why it's good. You were not consulted that it was coming in. Your kid showed up in school and there it was. And here you sit all this time later. We've had our 4 Wisconsin hearings, and most of the people, and this is true every place I've been talking about this, I would imagine with my 170 talks, I think I've spoken to between, a conservative estimate is between 60 and 70,000 Americans. It's dropping the bucket nationally. But still, it's a lot of people. And it's true everywhere I've been. 95% of the people in my audience don't know anything about it. Where's the DPI on it? And as a quick way of introducing myself into the talk, we had 4 hearings in Wisconsin. Did anybody go to the hearing? Did anybody go to the hearing in Madison? Good. If you saw the hearing in Madison, I was embarrassed for our superintendent of schools. He was asked, he got to lead off the hearings, Superintendent Evers. He got to lead off the hearings in Madison for the first 90 minutes, the first 4 talks. And he had the darndest time providing any information. He was asked specific. You can watch, one of the things you'll be able to see if you go to our website at the end here, you can watch all of Superintendent Evers' speech, right? You can judge for yourself. But he has a real hard time answering simple questions about Common Core. At one point he was asked specifically, you keep saying, the Common Core, people keep saying, that these standards have been internationally benchmarked, that all these high-achieving nations were consulted in putting the standards together. Can you provide us with any evidence? And he hemmed and he hawed, and he said, I'll get that to you. Well, 4 hearings later, he still hadn't provided it. Each of the 4 hearings began with the committee, Democrats and Republicans, asking representatives of the DPI, do you have that information yet? They never provided it. That's also interesting. For an educational set of standards and the curriculum that's grown up alongside it through the textbook companies, something as big as this, Secretary Evers did not attend 1 minute of the hearing, of the 4 hearings, other than his own testimony. He could not be bothered to attend 1 minute of the hearing. Also, by the time of the last hearing in Wausau, the committee, Democrats and Republicans, were begging him to come back one last time in Wausau and testify. He said he was too busy to do it. And yet, so the hearing in Wausau kicked off at 1 o'clock. At noon, by noon, Secretary Evers had driven all the way to Wausau, held a press conference, the building right next door to the one the hearing was in, and then drove back to Madison and said he couldn't attend the one. These are all facts that you can look up. And I'll give you one more thing. What I'm trying to suggest to you, if this is so obviously, unequivocally good and good for our kids and transparent, why? Just in your state, why? Why do 95% of you have no idea? In your state, why is our superintendent of schools being this evasive? One more time. By law, the DPI, whenever you have this kind of curriculum change in Wisconsin constitutionally, by law, the DPI was legally obligated to hold public hearings on Common Core by 1 September of last year. They didn't do it. They didn't do it in October, November. After 4 Wisconsin hearings were finally held, and only after extreme pressure to get it in by the end of the year, the superintendent of schools scheduled 3 hearings in 3 cities all at the same time, the same hour in the middle of the afternoon, 1 week before Christmas. Again, if what you're after at the DPI is clarity, and I could be wrong, maybe it's wonderful, Common Core, but if what you're after is clarity, and if what you're peddling is so remarkably good, this strikes me as not the kind of thing somebody does who's terribly confident that they're going to be able to explain what they're doing. So, last thing I'll say as I begin the talk is, I beg and encourage you, if you get as much information on this as you can, you'll listen to other people, try to seek out people who see it the other way, try to seek out people who support it, and get their word on it as well. That's what has to happen, right? If we do this all civilly, then people are going to get informed, and then it'll all sort itself out. So look for whatever you can find, and when people who are pro-Common Core speak, and try to encourage them to do more of it. Go listen. Go listen. All right. So given that we have a little bit of confusion, what is Common Core? Abbreviated term used to refer to the Common Core State Standards Initiative, a set of national standards for English and math with science guidelines forthcoming. Let's just stop midway through that sentence, because I have some issues with it. They call it the Common Core State Standards, and that suggests that the states had a primary role in crafting the standards. They didn't. There's no doubt that state people looked at them, but not in such a capacity as they could change them. The standards were paid for, drafted, written, validated, and those states that took them had took them before states had any meaningful look at them. And it's true that people in various states, most states, after all that had happened, they got to see them. I was just in North Dakota the week before last, and we had a conversation with the superintendent there, and she said, well, Dr. Pesta, 65 of our school teachers looked at the standards. I asked her when, and she conceded after the state had taken them. After they had been written. I asked her, did your 65 teachers have the ability to amend them? No. Did they have the ability to criticize them? No. Did they have the ability to suggest changes? No. So what were they doing then? I also asked her, she didn't answer this. And I'd love to know, in a state with 65 teachers, in a state like North Dakota, that's less than 1% of your teachers, what criterion did you use to pick the teachers? And she didn't want to answer that. But they're all fair questions, right? They call them the state standards, I assume, because they want you to think the states were integrally involved at every level. It's just not so. And so why do they use the term state standards? It's anybody's guess. Well, we know why. Whenever you're doing something like this that is this comprehensive, and let's face it, this secretive, these standards were crafted, they were paid for, drafted out, validated way back in 08, 09, 10, before they were put to schools. Nobody had the vaguest idea what was coming. Whenever you do something this big, it's as much a PR game as it is anything else. As a matter of fact, Common Core is branding so badly, the term Common Core, nationwide right now, that they've changed the name of the science standards. They're not Common Core Science, although if you flip through the Common Core Science standards, you flip through the next generation science standards, you will see Common Core all over the introductory material. But they changed the name. Why do you think they changed the name? Because Common Core is branding so bad. And so that's where we sit now. Now this is pretty shocking. Who owns it? I'm going to jump ahead one slide. Whatever your politics, whatever side of the aisle you're on with regards to Common Core, let me step back one step further. The thing that always frustrates me about the Common Core debate is that nobody who's for it ever wants to talk about how we got it. The answer you get all the time is, well, they're just standards, let's look at the standards. No, I think it matters. I think it matters a lot who wrote them, who owns them, how they got them into your schools. I think that's a big deal. The fact that most pro-Common Core people I've seen talk to, including at the hearings, don't want to talk about the origins and standards. This is the copyright for Common Core. It is owned not by the Department of Education, not by the federal government, not by the states, not by the House or the Senate, not by governors, not by teachers or teachers' unions, not by moms and dads. The people who own and copyright the Common Core state standards are people that are utterly unaccountable to the taxpayer in any way, shape, or form. There's your copyright. The NGA Center and the CCSSO shall be acknowledged as the sole owners and developers of the Common Core state standards, and no claims to the contrary shall be made. Ask yourself this: how in the world, in a democratic republic like ours, do people off the grid in terms of political elections, people who cannot be gotten to, how in the world are they able to copyright the curriculum standards that are beginning to transform American education? How do they do that? Who lets them do that? What gives them the authority to do that? I would like it much, 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 much more if the Department of Education held this copyright, because then if you had a problem with it, individually or collectively, you have some legal voter, electoral representative recourse, don't you? But how do you get at these people? And can I also ask you another question that I'm going to make clear as we move forward? Given what we know about the federal government over the last 20, 25 years, through Democrat, through Republican administrations, and what we know about this particular federal government, this is a federal government that is terribly, terribly, terribly protective of its own rights, jealously guarding its own rights. Do you honestly think the federal government would have allowed this relatively small group of people to do this without being complicit in it? And even if you think that didn't happen, how in the world did Common Core get into your schools? Do you honestly think that two lobbyist groups in Washington and Bill Gates could put it there? Because that's how it got paid for. Back in 2009, Bill Gates ponied up initially $150 million of his own money, his Gates Foundation money, to the Common Core committees, which basically are these two groups. The two groups responsible for the standards are the NGA and the CCSSO. The NGA is the National Governors Association. And that's another one of those naming things, isn't it? When you hear the word NGA, National Governors, I actually heard Tony Eager say this. Well, this is an effort of the governors. Wait a second. The NGA has been called, by two sitting governors in it, a meet and greet place for politicians and their aides to meet with lobbyists and other interested parties. The function of the National Governors Association is to get input, oftentimes, not exclusively, but oftentimes from lobbyists to move the country one way or another. But even if you think all 50 governors had a hand in this, because when you think of National Governors Association, it's tempting to think of 50 state governors locked in a room, hammering out education standards. I would rather that happen than this, but I would still ask you this question. What qualifies Governor Scott Walker to write education standards? Or Chris Christie? What qualifies any state governor to write education standards? What's their credential in this? There's not a state governor of the 50 that are currently sitting that have anything like the experience to begin to craft education, particularly for a whole country. I wish it had happened that way, but it didn't. These two groups, in fact, I see a lot of you taking notes, which is good, that means you're checking me. Let me give you a name to write down. Write down Joy Pullman, Pullman. She works for the Heartland Institute in Chicago. She has written a definitive article, picked up all over the place, New York Times, picked up overseas. Joy writes an article, The 5 People Who Wrote Common Core. She traces the writing of Common Core in its most pivotal state back to just 5 people. Just 5. Chief of whom, another name you must look up, David Coleman. Coleman. David Coleman has been called the architect of the Common Core standards. He is the big mind behind them. And if you look at his educational background, he doesn't have nearly enough educational experience to be able to draft that standard. He does not. You can find him on Wikipedia. I'd be careful if you go to Wikipedia and look him up, because there are things in his bio that are really going to upset you. In fact, the 5 people that Joy traces Common Core back to most prolifically, all of them have deep ties to the federal government. All of them have deep ties to President Obama and to the Department of Education and Arne Duncan. That's important to note. So ask yourself this question. All right, you got it. Basically 5 people, and of course it branched out, but not until those 5 people took the money, drafted the standards, finalized them, and then had them verified. Not until all those things happened did other people come into this. And in almost every state case of every state, that much after the standards had been validated, did the states finally get to look at them. And so what happens here? Bill and Melinda Gates put up $150 million originally, and here we are 4 years later, and in a recent article about a month ago, Bill Gates conceded that he has spent to date $2.5 billion implementing these standards. And by that, he means writing $1 million grants to the National Parent-Teachers Association, writing $1 million grants to the chambers, the state and federal chambers of commerce, writing $1 million grants to the National Catholic Education Association, the chief Catholic watchdog of Catholic schools, who has received hundreds of thousands of dollars in grants from the Bill Gates Institution, the Fordham Institute. If you remember the hearings, just about the only outside testimony the school board, the superintendent of schools, brought in to support Common Core was a man by the name of Thomas Petrilli from the Fordham Institute. Fordham is allegedly a right-wing conservative think tank, and Fordham supported Common Core full-throatedly. No one pointed at, as it was pointed out at meetings, and it's easy enough to verify, the Fordham Institute has received over $6 million in the last 3 years from Bill and Melinda Gates. These are things that you can't deny them. They're obviously true. Now, simply taking $6 million from Bill Gates, I don't suppose that necessarily means that you're biased, but what if the shoe is on the other foot? What if I was getting paid I love that. What if I was getting paid $6 million? You'd probably take me with a much even bigger grain of salt than I'm telling you to take me on record. That's why we don't charge speaker fees for this. I don't get paid to do this. All 95 talks in Wisconsin, sometimes we cover our traveling expenses, sometimes we don't. It's not about that. So, I want you to think about this. And it gets even more interesting. Of those 5 people, those 2 groups, even if you think the NGA is a big deal, it's all these governors, what qualifies those people to write standards that can, and how do you get into your schools? 2 lobbyist groups do not have the ability to put this into your public schools. They just don't. And even if you had all 50 state governors approve this, they themselves, and Governor Walker doesn't have the ability to impose education standards on the DEI. You can't do that. Your governors, even if all 50 of them did participate, they couldn't do it. How to get in your schools? Well, how many of you remember the Race to the Top program? Remember, you heard that word? Okay. Race to the Top. Back in 2008, 2009, Obama and the federal government, they put together the Race to the Top program. That was back, if you recall, when they were stimulating things like car companies and banks. And, well, they wanted a noble idea, I suppose. They decided they wanted to stimulate education. Overwhelmingly, most state education budgets were big time in the red. Right? Give me an example. For the example. So they created a program called Race to the Top, where they took billions and billions of dollars of taxpayer money, and they made it available to the state education departments. To give you my example, New York State, in the initial round of applications for the Race to the Top, New York State received $700 million from the federal government in 2009. $700 million. Simply by applying for it. That money was given directly to the State Department of Education in New York. And all they had to do in New York, they could spend that money on anything they want educationally. Tetherballs, teacher contracts, computers, whatever they wanted. The only proviso in Race to the Top to take that money, the only one, was if you take Race to the Top money, you have to accept the Common Core standards when they are finally written. The vast majority of states that took Common Core took it without ever having seen it. This is why I keep saying it's not a state curriculum, or a state set of standards. How can it be? And you know, Common Core, Bill Gates, David Coleman, they could not have got it in your school. It took the federal government through the Race to the Top program to do it. That's how 46 states in the Union ended up with Common Core. 44 of them, of those 46, had never seen the standards before they were forced to adopt them. Now you think about that for a second. People will say it's not a federal curriculum. It's not a federal set of curriculum standards. Well, if the only people who could put it in your schools is the federal government, what do we make of that? Now do you understand why the federal government feels it has the authority to tell any state that wants to back out? You either do what we tell you or else. How about, did you see what Arnie Duncan's going to do? Secretary of Education? Oh, and by the way, Arnie Duncan, our Secretary of Education. Does anybody know what his primary major's in? It's not education. The man running public education in this country has a main degree, primary degree in sociology. Which fits, I think, what Common Core is. But let me ask you this. Well, let me remind you, if you didn't see it, just last week, a couple days ago, Arnie Duncan made a national pronouncement. They are putting federal agents in the state schools. Federal agents in the state DPIs. Why? To make sure those states implement Common Core the way the federal government wants them to. That's a fact. Go check, just check 2 days ago. Arnie Duncan now is going to put federal agents, federal Department of Education agents at various levels of state school administration to make sure you guys are implementing Common Core the correct way, the federal way. maybe you're not bothered. I just want to make it clear. Maybe you're not bothered by the fact this is federal. But how do you argue it's not? No sooner did the Common Core curriculum committee do its work than they kind of disbanded. There isn't really a sitting Common Core committee anymore. And how's this for shocking? No sooner did David Coleman finish the drafting of the standards than he immediately rotated off Common Core and became the CEO of the College Boards, where he is right now rewriting the SATs to conform to Common Core. How is that not incestuous? And how do we countenance that as a free people? The unaccountable man, the man utterly unaccountable to you and me and taxpayers, the man who wrote the standards primarily is now, without missing a beat, is in charge of changing the exams that our kids are required to get into college to conform to his program. And you're not even in your second year of it in Wisconsin fully. You think about that for a second. How is that not a screeching conflict of interest? And do you honestly think a federal government as protective as this one would have allowed it to happen if they didn't want it to happen? Oh, and let me give you another little piece of history. Because of a 1965 federal statute, the federal government is prohibited from creating a national curriculum or a set of national standards. Can't do it. Legal. It's illegal. But I think this is the next best thing. Because the people who have the copyright, you can always point to them and say, it's not us, there's the copyright. But they're all people, and I don't know any other way to phrase this, utterly in bed with this administration, and utterly in bed with this Department of Education. Just go look them up. Right? Read Joy's article. It is staggering. So they write it, they draft it, they copyright it. The federal government has plausible deniability. We didn't do anything. But again, I remind you, how in the world did it get in your schools? It didn't get in your schools. Arnie Duncan didn't put it there. David Coleman didn't put it there. The feds did through the Race to the Top program. Now that's a remarkable thing. Now let me also ask you a question. I told you the bipartisan nature of this, and I believe it. But let me ask you this. What do you think? I really do believe many of the people who support Common Core now would be just as against it if it was exactly the same set of standards. If instead of Bill and Melinda Gates, that billionaire, what if it was the evil Koch brothers who put up $2.5 billion of their own money? And what if instead of two left-leaning lobbyist groups, you had two right-leaning ones? And what if instead of a very liberal president, you had a very conservative one who basically bribed 46 states in the union to take a set of standards that nobody had seen? I don't know about you, but I would be every bit as aggravated about this as I am now. And if you see the problem with this, can you imagine Harry Reid's head? It would explode all over the Senate floor if the Koch brothers were behind this. Well, every cloud has a silver lining.
That'd be a good thing.
But you get my point, right? And if you would be outraged, I would, if that's how it happened. Why does this matter? Why is this okay? This is banana republic stuff. And this is why nobody wants to talk to you about how we got these standards. They're just standards. Pesta, let's look at the standards. I hear that all the time. It is shockingly irresponsible. It's banana republic stuff. And before we move forward, I have one last initial piece of history. I want to set up what I think the standards are. Because Common Core is not new. There's this weird sense that, particularly for people who don't pay much attention to these things, that Common Core just sort of evaporated into thin air. That we had nothing, you keep hearing the argument, right? That if you don't support Common Core, well, you're just not serious and you don't want standards. You don't want standards. Didn't we hear that with the Affordable Care Act? If you don't support the Affordable Care Act, you want people to die in the streets. If you don't support the latest right-wing radical feminist agenda for us, well then it's a war on women, right? Over and over again, if you oppose, as if the only answer to our educational woes is this set of standards. By definition, education is standards. We've always had standards. Sometimes they've been higher than this, and sometimes they've been lower. But the idea that somehow we have to have standards all of a sudden, we've always had them. And as I think you're going to see, I don't think these standards are necessarily all that high. But here's the other piece of information. And this is a fact that you need to look up as well. There is no evidence whatsoever, none, no statistical, analytical data whatsoever, to suggest that having a formal set of standards, even a set of high standards in your state, has the slightest impact on how your kids perform in a classroom. There's no evidence for it. There have been about 40 different surveys done by groups of all different political stripes. Most recently, last year, the left-leaning Brookings Institute did the most comprehensive study available. And they found absolutely no link between stated standards in your state and the actual student performance. So why do we keep doing it? Common Core is not new. We've been doing Common Core for about 40 years. Can anybody remind me of what the same principle, the same paradigm was before Common Core? What did we have before Common Core? No Child Left Behind. And in the full interest of bipartisan disclosure, who gave us No Child Left Behind? George Bush. Although, interestingly, do you know? George Bush didn't write No Child Left Behind. He farmed it out to a senator. Who did he give it to? Who wrote it? Whose people wrote it?
Ted Kennedy.
Ted Kennedy, right? Ted Kennedy's people wrote it. In fact, Ted Kennedy and his people are exclusively responsible for it. And George Bush deserves every bit of blame for it. And you know, I have never yet met a teacher, not yet, or a principal or a superintendent who has anything really but contempt for Common Core. They didn't like it. One of the reasons they were so eager to get out of Common Core, or out of No Child Left Behind, is because nobody liked it. And in order to talk about Common Core, we have to spend a moment talking about why everybody hated No Child Left Behind. Well, number one, it's outcome-based education, which isn't a new idea. It goes back at least to the founding of the Department of Education in the late 70s, and actually quite a bit before it. It's outcome-based education, which means the main and really the only objective in the bottom line is to get kids to a certain point. It doesn't matter where you're starting with those kids. It doesn't matter what your social circumstances, the familial circumstances are. It doesn't matter attitudes or intelligent levels. The bottom line is teachers are put under an inordinate amount of pressure to get kids to a certain point. How many of you have kids or grandkids? To say all of you do. Can you get your 2 sons and your 2 daughters to perform exactly or even close to the same way in all the different subject areas? And they always laugh when I ask that. You can't, can you? Well, if you can't do it, how in the world are you going to do it with 60 million American school kids? It's just not possible. And yet we put all this emphasis on where they come out rather than the state and local control things, right? Where the more you devolve onto the teachers in the classrooms in your community, the more you trust them and let them do. Why? Why do we have to have this national penumbra? What does it actually do for us? Outcome-based education, right? We're going to take these kids regardless of their attitudes, regardless of their intelligence, regardless of their home life. You see what, and when we say high stakes, the other problem with No Child Left Behind is that it was, how do you meet that standard? If you've got a big national standard, what's the only way you can meet it? Testing. And so do the math on me with this. If the only meaningful way you can decide whether your kids meet the standard or not is to test them, what do your 2 teachers have to teach to? It just makes sense, doesn't it? And is that really the best way to go? Is that what you want your teachers doing? To be handed some test, some script? And when we say high stakes testing, it's not high stakes for the kids, although they're the ones being left behind in No Child Left Behind. The high stakes means high stakes for the teachers, right? Let me defend teachers as a 20-year teacher. If you can't get your 4 kids to the same standard in your own house, how are your teachers who see 30 different new kids a semester, how are they going to get kids to a standard? How can they do it? And the high stakes is simply because that's our accountability mechanism, right? And you think about that. If your school doesn't meet the standards, if your classroom doesn't meet the standards, you could be removed. If your school doesn't meet the standard, a principal could be denied a promotion or reassigned someplace else. You understand that all the way up, this is a bad way to do school accountability. And what does it do to our kids when everything depends solely on these tests? So that's, oh, and you remember what happened under No Child Left Behind? 2006, 2007, 2008. Remember places like Atlanta, Georgia, and North Carolina, and New York City, where teachers and principals and even 2 superintendents were taking the kids' standardized test scores and dumping them in the trash and forging new exams. And I understand why they did it, because everything depends on those arbitrary tests. And you're telling me that you're going to have the same standard for a kid living in Mayville, and a kid living in the inner city of Chicago, and a kid living in Nome, Alaska. As much as this utopian dream of getting everyone to the same place all the time exists, it's not practicable. And why would you want it? It's a dream. And can I just say this too, because this is right where people accuse you of pulling out the tinfoil hat. But if we stop and think about what outcome-based education is, and I say this respectfully, isn't it just a kind of socialism? Rather than deal with kids where they are and try to meet them with their talents and skills and worry about what you're putting in, all we're worried about is what comes out. So consequently, again, whether a kid tries or doesn't try, cares or doesn't care, has a good attitude or a bad attitude, a working home life or a broken one, intelligence in certain subjects or not, and I'll be the first to tell you, I know one thing, which is why I'm an English professor. I can't do anything else. Right? I get it. So what? So what? The world needs more than CPAs, people. That's the argument, though. Isn't that kind of a quasi-socialism? That regardless of what you put into it, everybody comes out the same? And that just strikes me as exactly that kind of a paradigm. So you got the outcome-based education, you got the high-stakes testing, and you got the one-size-fits-all education of Common Core, of No Child Left Behind, because that's it, right? We're gonna cut every kid down to the same standard. right? And if that means you got to cut off an arm here, or cut off a leg there to get the kid to fit in the standard, then we do it. And that means if you have to put a kid on the rack and stretch him till you get him to that standard, then you got to do that too. This is why it failed. And it failed before it failed with No Child Left Behind. It failed with Goals 2000. And back and back and back. And yet one of the big problems in the federal government, regardless of who's the president or who's in control of Congress, whenever a big government idea fails, they never back up and say, let's try a different way. It's always, let's do more of the same. Let's throw more money at it, and let's federalize it more. And that's, to me, what Common Core is. Common Core, I believe, is No Child Left Behind us here. All the worst aspects that teachers hated about No Child, aren't they all in Common Core? Aren't the testing mechanisms even more rigorous? Isn't the standard even more fixed in stone and more broad-reaching? This is why it didn't work. And yet that's what Common Core is. Only, what was it that killed No Child Left Behind? It wasn't the federal government saying, gee, we made a mistake. It was the problem, the big mistake No Child Left Behind made is it left a whole lot of latitude for teachers and local school boards, school districts. No Child Left Behind was killed from the ground up because it didn't work. Working teachers and working classrooms and students, it didn't work. And there was enough pressure from below to above to be able to kill that. It took 12 years, but they killed it. One of the big features of Common Core, and you're already seeing it at the federal level with what's happening to Indiana. Once this thing gets fully federalized, which is the objective of it, how do you back out of it? How do you kill it from the ground up anymore? If there's one design flaw Common Core fixed, it was the amount of influence you're going to ultimately have from below. That's what they fixed. Again, unaccountable people behind the standards. Can't be voted in or out. All that federal money to take us, and it's not even the money that they've already paid the states. It's all the money that's promised to be forthcoming for those states who shut up and behave and continue to implement the program. It's a big deal. But right now, when you're under No Child Left Behind in your schools, and I'm predicating this by saying, we're not anywhere near full implementation of Common Core. Nowhere near. Think about what happens when we get it. When pretty much every subject area in your schools aligns with the national test. That's what they want. And there's a standard, even in gym class, there's a standard for everything. And your kids have to test at the standard. When that finally happens, right now in your schools, and even under No Child Left Behind, if there was a book you didn't want your kid to read, or a sex lesson, or a movie being showed, go to your teacher, and 99 times out of 100, you opt your kid out. Easy peasy. But when this gets fully implemented, if it ever does, do you think when it's all controlled that way and everything is part of a test mechanism, are you going to be able to opt your kids out? You're going to go to your principal, teacher's going to tell you to talk to the principal, going to tell you to talk to the superintendent, who's going to send you to the Department of Education in Madison, and they're going to give you the phone number for 1-800 Arnie Duncan. How much Muzak do you think you're going to have to listen to before Arnie picks up the phone? Do you understand that the concerns about state and local control are not right now, as it's just being rolled into your schools? It's what's going to happen when the whole umbrella creeps in. But again, in the same way, those who support it will not talk about how we got it. They will not talk about what might happen either. Let's just look at these standards and pay attention to nothing else. I think it's a dishonest argument. It matters how you got this. It really matters.